So anyway, my topic is who leads Euro area governance. If you were wondering about this choice of background slide, when I was deciding on the background slide, I saw the mountains and I thought Scotland, Highlands, mountains, close enough. So this is the theme. There's no connection between this and the topic of Euro area governance. So anyway, where I'm going to go and start with is with the good old community method, which most people who are accustomed to studying European integration are already very familiar with. And this has to do with the institutional triangle of how decisions are made in the European Union, where we have a proposal coming from the European Commission, and it goes to the Council and the European Parliament for deliberations, and this is how regulations and directives are traditionally made. But monetary union has always been a little bit different. And ever since monetary union, the plans for monetary union began, we've seen some substantial deviations from the community method. And I would add that it's not only in monetary union, but I think that it is quite stark and distinct in monetary union, especially if we take into account the events since the global financial crisis and the sovereign debt crisis, which leads up to the broader issue of has the community method given way to intergovernmentalism, which is an interesting topic right now for those interested in European studies. So monetary union was always different. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, we had the Maastricht Treaty that allowed for opt-outs. Again, it wasn't only for monetary union, but monetary union was one of the prominent policies in which it was possible for a member state not to become part of monetary union, which Denmark and the UK decided to do. So from now until the end of time, neither Denmark nor the UK have to join monetary union. This isn't the case for other member states, so the states that joined in 2004 and later on, and all these subsequent states that joined the European Union are expected to adopt the entire acquis, including monetary union. So the opt-out part is over, but we still have this differentiated integration within monetary union. And that has to do with the necessity of qualifying to be part of monetary union. So unlike many of the policies in EMU, it's not enough just to pass the Copenhagen criteria and become an EU member, but you also have to pass the separate Maastricht Treaty convergence criteria, which was designed to ensure that the countries were similar enough to one another that they would be able to form a monetary union without great difficulty. And I'm going to leave aside the questions on whether or not these were the best criteria or the most appropriate criteria. We all see how well monetary union has worked out since then, that there are some serious questions to pose to that. But nevertheless, the Maastricht Treaty convergence criteria still exist, and it is still required for a member state that wants to join monetary union to pass the convergence criteria. And finally, another way that monetary union was always a little bit different in terms of its governance structure was the open method of coordination, which was introduced, broadly speaking, with the Lisbon Agenda, when we started first using this terminology of the open method of coordination. And with the open method of coordination, instead of having regulations or directives, what you would have would be member state representatives getting together to go and discuss matters of economic policy and try to go and reach a consensus or an understanding amongst one another, learn from one another, and perhaps achieve an agreement on benchmarking and best practices. And so this is, again, a rather strong deviation from the open method of coordination that results in regulations and directives. These are more ideas to be shared, ideas of learning from one another, and perhaps suggesting to one another that this is the best way to proceed. But unlike other normal regulations, if a state did not abide by what occurred as a result of the open method of coordination, they weren't punished. The original idea was that peer pressure would be enough to punish one another, that countries could name and shame a country that did not abide by what was agreed upon by the open method of coordination. but that also didn't work out very well with the naming and shaming. So these are some ways in which monetary union was always a little bit different in terms of an acquis communautaire that was followed by the community method. So it seems that with the global financial crisis that we've been expanding the a la carte menu even further, and we're deviating even more from this idea of an acquis communautaire that's established through the community method that is then adopted by all members of monetary union. And we can see the Euro Plus Pact and the Treaty on Stability, Coordination, and Governance being the most recent examples, where these are treaties that do not encompass all of the members of the European Union. They encompass most of the members, but not all of the members. And it is a voluntary decision on the part of the member states on whether or not they want to go and be a member of this. Of course, membership has its privileges. If it didn't have its privileges, it wouldn't make sense to be a member. But nevertheless, we have an even more loose association as economic and monetary integration proceed within monetary union. So this leads me to the next question. Have we gone too far when it comes to our expansiveness in Euro area governance? And the two areas that I am going to look at very briefly are the Six-Pack and the Treaty on Stability, Coordination, and Governance, because I think that they are two very interesting examples of how far we have diverged from the community method, and then ask what are the consequences of this. So first of all, we had the Six-Pack. And the Six-Pack, it was originally before the Greek crisis really exploded in 2010 that year at the March European Council, they decided at this meeting to go and delegate the task to the Commission to go and come up with a response so that we can go and reform the economic governance of the European Union and particularly the Eurozone and strengthen this to avoid problems from occurring in the future. And at the same time, the European Council also decided to delegate the task to Herman Van Rompuy to form a task force to think of how the European Union or the Euro area could reform again in order to avoid future crises and become stronger as a result of governance, which led to this very interesting process where the Van Rompuy task force wound up being comprised of ECOFIN with Herman Van Rompuy at the helm, going back and forth between the European Commission, and within a month of each other, both the Commission and the Van Rompuy Task Force unveil what are essentially the Six-Pack proposals that officially emanate from the Commission under the community method, as you will, but on the other hand, much credit is also given to the Van Rompuy Task Force. And they aren't completely similar, but they are very much in line with one another, and they're informing one another. So after we have these broadly set of similar proposals coming up in the fall, it goes through the European Parliament and the Council. The Council tries to water it down, and the European Parliament goes even further in strengthening it and stands up for the stronger proposals that had originally been made with the Six-Pack proposals. Secondly, the Treaty on Stability, Coordination, and Governance is also a very recent treaty that builds on the Stability and Growth Pact and the Six-Pack proposals and makes fiscal coordination and debt and deficits even more important areas of concern for the member states of the Euro area and the European Union, which leads to the question, well, why an intergovernmental treaty? So why is this not happening within the context of the community governance the community governance within the community method? And there is broad agreement that the measures in this treaty could have been done within existing EU legislation, and that an intergovernmental treaty wasn't really necessary from that perspective. So why an intergovernmental treaty, and what are the implications of this? We did see the association of supranational institutions, but nevertheless, this was still an intergovernmental treaty. So the analytical framework that I would suggest to analyze this is that of a principal agent framework, where you think of the member states, the European Council, forming the principles, and first of all, the Commission is an agent, and we can also look at the other body in the sense of the six-pack of the Van Rompuy Task Force as also being another agent of the European Council, because they were both delegated their tasks during the same European Council session in March of 2010. And given the potential danger of what's known as agency drift, where an agent deviating from the objectives of the principle, that the Van Rompuy Task Force could be considered to be like a police patrol of the Commission, and thereby ensuring that the Commission's proposals do not go too far. And it also serves an additional purpose of allowing a greater priority and a greater credit taking on the part of the member states. As I'd already outlined before, when it came to the next step and the European Parliament getting involved, the European Parliament was quite forceful in exercising the new powers that it was granted thanks to the Treaty of Lisbon. And afterwards, when it came to renegotiating or negotiating further fiscal policy coordination at the level of the European Union, what we saw was the European Parliament and to a certain extent the European Commission rather sidelined in this, because it was taking place within the context of an intergovernmental treaty rather than the European Commission. So you might then ask yourself, well, what difference does it make? Because first of all, at the end of the day, as a result of the six-pack and as a result of the Treaty on Stability, Coordination, and Governance, we do see the powers of supranational institutions increased. So the European Commission does have more power than it did before. Moreover, they also took part in the various conversations and discussions in the negotiations for both the treaty as well as for the six-pack. As Gabriel Galacqua had argued earlier this morning, there's no other place for them to go. And so he had noted that he was less concerned about what has been seen as the intergovernmental turn in Euro area governance on the one hand, because where else are you going to go to have these eventually implemented? And also you're going to have these institutions speaking to one another to take advantage of their shared knowledge. So in the end, does it matter that the European institutions are sidelined or less used or are tightly monitored as a result of the global financial crisis and then the sovereign debt market crisis? But still, we can argue that this is, first of all, usurping the traditional agenda-setting role of institutions like the Commission. Because even though the Commission was the one that started the legislative ball rolling with the six-pack, if you look at the different reports and even from Council conclusions from the ECOFIN Council, it's frequently not the Commission that is given credit for this, but the member states themselves, the Van Rompuy Task Force, which really amounts to ECOFIN congratulating itself and Van Rompuy for these proposals, but they're just wearing different hats when they did them. Secondly, we could also see this as a reinforcement of the intergovernmental tendencies that had really been taking off ever since the global financial crisis. And if you can recall, when the global financial crisis hit Europe in the fall of 2008, that in October of that year, President Sarkozy, as the president of the European Council at the time, had suggested what are now known as the Euro area summits, that he thought the heads of state and government of the Euro area should be meeting regularly. And at the time, this was quickly dismissed. This is excessive. This is too intergovernmental for most people's taste. But in fact, this is exactly what had happened. And if we look at the trajectory of how decisions have been made since the global financial crisis in the fall of 2008, up until the most recent treaties, including the Euro Plus Pact and the Treaty on Stability, Coordination, and Governance, that this is reinforcing an intergovernmental tendency and role in the European Union, which could have some important consequences, especially in terms of legitimacy. And so to go and conclude, I first of all pose a question and the possibility that this is simply due to exceptional circumstances. Exceptional circumstances require exceptional measures. At the end of the day, it is true that the supranational institutions get more power in the end, and so maybe when the dust is settled and things are calmer, that the community method will return and will come back. But on the other hand, will it? Will we have a new governance structure that is more intergovernmental rather than communitarian? And what are the implications of this, not just in terms of output, but also in the democratic input, as we heard about earlier this morning from Francisco Torres' presentation, the input, especially the role of democratic institutions like the European Parliament when it comes to European economic governance.
Well, thanks very much. Like Michelle, I'll just peer over the lectern here, if I may. And I was struck as I was coming over on the plane from Brussels last night, reading through this programme, just what a range of impressive and very international talent Edinburgh University has, as ever, been able to gather into a setting spectacular as this. You're all very, very welcome to Scotland. You've come on a beautiful sunny day, but it's always like this. We always have weather like this. It rains a couple of days a year. But for those of you who are new to Scotland, you're very welcome. Do enjoy your time here. And for those of you who come from further afield, enjoy your time in Europe. Now, you're here at a fascinating and energising time, both in Scotland and in the wider European Union. Now, I couldn't not mention our constitutional ongoing discussion in Scotland. I'm an SNP member. We are having a very live discussion in Scotland about who should represent us, what powers they should have to decide on our behalf, and how we should interact with other institutions, countries, and supranational organisations in our interconnected world. That's essentially what our discussion about independence or the status quo or whatever else we decide to do is about. And that's actually precisely the discussion that we're having within the European Union as well. And that's precisely where the attempts to tackle the difficulties in the current Euro architecture are falling down, because we have not had that thoroughgoing discussion, and the institutions that could fix this lack the legitimacy, and the institutions that are trying to fix this lack the common demos. So I've been asked to talk about the role of the Parliament in all this, so I'll give you, forgive me, I think we must have a bit of a political overview as to how we got here, both in terms of the economics and the global events and the political response to it. What the Parliament can and has done, and perhaps a little more bravely, I'll sketch out a couple of ideas going into the future in terms of where I think policy needs to go in order to actually remedy the architectural difficulties which have arisen in, I'll give you a word of the Gaelic, fixing this búrach. The Gaelic, as it often does, more beautifully expresses what we want to say. A búrach is a loose translation for a muddle, a disaster, a fix, a mess that the euro has seemingly become. By way of my own bona fides, I'm an international finance lawyer to trade. I qualified with a London firm called Clifford Chance. I worked in practice for a number of years prior to my election, and within the Parliament I sat on the temporary committee of inquiry that we had into the financial crisis in 2009. And one of the key roles which the Parliament has been able to do in all this, and as Michelle says, it's been pretty limited what we've been able to do in all this, has been to ventilate what went wrong. Now that has been a useful function. Retrospectively, I'm not sure we've learned many lessons going forward in terms of how to apply that. But as a brief overview, in terms of how did we get here, and as with all things, if you were on the road to Tipperary, I wouldn't start out from here. We are in an unhappy place in global politics. We're in an unhappy place in European politics. And in order to work out where to go, I think we need to clearly understand where we've come from. It's important to remember that lots of people do seem to have forgotten that the euro was a political project. It was a political project that bent the laws of economics. As Michelle even said, we bent the laws of the European Union in order to make it work, to make it fit. And you can only do that for so often until the laws of economics snap back, as we have seen. Now, the project is, contrary to Eurosceptic paranoia, not about control of anybody's economy. It's about the encouragement of what I'd, forgive me, a fairly clunky phrase, the Scando-Germanification of the wider European economy. I said it was clunky, but bear with me. It's a ruthless focus via the central bank on monetary stability, on sound money, monetary discipline, fiscal rigour, that in itself then forcing a need to compete on quality and innovation, export-led growth, all pretty good stuff and worthy in itself. Now, I sound approving, and I certainly am, because I am particularly drawn to that economic model, and if I was choosing an economic model for Scotland, I would assuredly go for the Scando-German one rather than where we are right now. It would work well for us from a Scottish perspective. It would seem that it has worked rather less well for a number of other economies. So the Euro states, and by which I mean the states who have signed up to Economic and Monetary Union, the 25 out of the 27, signed up to a series of good intentions, crucially a set of externalized willpower in the Growth and Stability Pact. I'll be using externalized willpower as a phrase a lot because that's where we are seeing the difficulties in enforcing what needs to be done to fix this. But of course, there was a credibility deficit from the start. No sooner was the Growth and Stability Pact in existence than it was breached. First, ironically enough, by the Germans, as they coped with the economic shocks of reunification. But it was then breached by everybody else as well. There was a shocking lack of oversight and rigour. Breaches were glossed over and demonstrably unreliable, and in a few cases, patently made up and fictitious figures and statistics were accepted without proper scrutiny. And the European Parliament must accept our share of the blame in that. There was a lack of oversight in any meaningful sense. But we thought things were going swimmingly because we trusted. We trusted that the measures which had been put in place to alert us to problems were being properly implemented. They simply weren't. Because, remember, we were all having so much fun. This coincided with a global credit boom because of the Chinese savings rates, because of the oil exporting nations having vast amounts of money to find a home for. It found a home via our banking system in our markets. This cheap credit led to the banks encouraging a ruinous credit boom and explosion of personal debt. That led to house price inflation, which egged the banks on to greater profits, greater risks. It egged people onto increasing personal debt because house prices always rise. That's a safe thing to do. So the banks had massive profits, and that encouraged management and shareholders and then regulators and governments to collectively lose our marbles, and everybody took bigger and bigger and sillier risks. Now, the lawyer in me, as a due diligence is a well-understood legal term, none of us were immune. Even here in Scotland, we took great national pride at the gutsy success of RBS. We were all delighted to see what it was up to. We were all delighted to see all sorts of growth and spectacular success because we trusted that the systems, the checks and balances that have served capitalism pretty well over the years were all working. We trusted in sound management by sensible people. We trusted in enlightened shareholder oversight. We trusted in scrutiny by outside professionals who were serious. Turns out they didn't work. And it was only in the aftermath, when the music stopped, we all realized that RBS had invented terms of obscenities like due diligence light in the takeover of ABN AMRO. Now, that is a ludicrous. I personally would have such recklessness ranking alongside criminality. That is a grievously reckless situation for our economy to be. And we all paid the price. But when the music stopped, as always in bubbles, irrational exuberance turned to irrational panic. And this was where the European Parliament started to add some real value with the Temporary Committee of Inquiry, which we set up to hear evidence from various points of the compass into how did this go wrong, what can we do about it. And we had a session with the Deputy Governor of the Swedish Central Bank, which is my abiding memory of the whole process. And in his presentation about the lessons we could learn from the Nordic banking crisis of the early 90s, his opening line was that we started with a desire to avoid moral hazard. Now that would have been a pretty useful starting point for all the bailout packages that we did in the rest of the world, because moral hazard strikes me as the biggest ongoing difficulty in finding a long-term solution to where we are. Over a series of patch and mend bailouts, previously sound economies effectively nationalized the debts that had been built up in the private sector. That created a sovereign crisis which had not quite thought through the implications that the traditional method out, the traditional way out of a sovereign economy is, of course, devaluation or quantitative easing. The externalized willpower of the Eurozone meant that was not as possible as it used to be. So that was where, and I confess I don't believe in reincarnation. There you go, I've given you Scando-Germanification of economies. I'm giving you high philosophy now. I don't believe in reincarnation, but in the event I do grace the planet again, I want to come back as the bond market, because it really does scare people, and it really does answer to nobody. So that was where the bailouts all started. And we've got a variety of crises which are interlocking presently. We've got a personal debt crisis, we've got a banking crisis, we've got a wider economic crisis, and we've got the sovereign debt crisis. It's my contention that the euro didn't cause any of them. The euro has, by the strictures that it imposes on the sovereign governments, made it rather more difficult to fix them. As Michele far more clearly than I can outlined, the pan-national democratic institutions of the European Union have been uniquely frozen out of being part of the solution to that, which has meant that we have had to fall back on the member state governments acting in the Council, which itself does not operate as a pan-Euro institution. We've seen it break down into national interest. So that's where we've started to be bedeviled. The European Parliament has been shut out by virtue of the intergovernmental method. I could make the political points about David Cameron flouncing out of meetings which were trying to fix things that could have used the community method but now can't, weakened the efforts at a crucial time. I think that was singularly unfortunate. That's, to an extent, part of history. But given the audience, I won't get into the ESM or the six-pack or the two-pack or whatever many packs we're going to need in order to actually fix it. But it is safe to say that the supranational euro architecture, in terms of monitoring and supervision, was not matched by swift or decisive supranational crisis management, giving a shocking lack of trust or community spirit amongst the member states, and a chronic inability, due to lack of power or lack of legitimacy, on the part of those institutions who would have been able to fill that gap. Those who would have been able to act on this, the Commission, the Parliament, the European Central Bank, lack the democratic legitimacy or the power to become involved in any meaningful sense. Now, there's good reasons for that. The European Central Bank is the guardian against inflation and nothing else. Now, there are other roles which the European Central Bank has adopted via the back door, given the political sensitivities of the Council, but that is itself an incredible way of dealing with this crisis. It's patch and make mend. There's a lack of credibility in the eyes of the bond market, which does operate very effectively across borders as a pan-national entity at a time when Europe's political structures plainly do not. So we've not seen a pan-Euro approach to fixing the shortcomings of the Eurozone. We've seen national mistrust hamstring us. Now there was, and I remember it well, there was every willingness on the part of the German state to support concerted bailouts, but that was hamstrung by a lack of trust within the Council and the very real and ongoing risk of moral hazard. The political logic really is pretty clear. The Germans were unwilling, frankly, to sign any piece of paper and take it seriously so long as Silvio Berlusconi's name was on it. You can track back exactly to his demise being when we actually started to see a concerted, proper response. It was bluntly, would you? So we had a real difficulty of credibility within the Council. We had a complete lack of trust amongst the member state governments, which did not act as one unified council, broke down into creditors and debtors, broke down into goodies and baddies, and we saw all sorts of really pretty ugly politics. You know, the thrifty south, thrifty north versus the spendthrift south, etc. We saw all sorts of poor politics. We've seen a media which has jumped on this with glee at a time when an awful lot of people across the European continent are having a dreadful, dreadful time. And the political response has been inadequate. So there was lots of difficulties in terms of the absence of sufficient trust to permit and facilitate a comprehensive solution. So instead, we've seen an irrational focus on austerity. The logic being that if you're willing to sign up to a share of pain that makes us think you're serious, we'll bail you out. That has been a patch and make mend solution which has encouraged resentment in precisely the member states that have actually been assisted by these programs. Now we'll see how the Irish voted yesterday, but the Irish debate on this has been fascinating. The Irish population has resented bearing the brunt of austerity, which they don't feel responsible for, they don't feel they caused, and they feel has been enforced upon them by somebody else. That's bad for democracy, that's bad for European community spirit. That spirals and gets worse. What happens in the Greek election? Likewise, we are seeing an exacerbation of difficulties. So the government's being forced to inflict a degree of austerity, which, as if government spending caused this problem, which is my contention it didn't, by and large, as if austerity is the solution where there's been very little focus on actually encouraging growth, and a more Keynesian response to this in terms of encouraging growth has been incredibly poor. So in terms of what we need to do, we need to get real, we need to get our act together. I called 2 years ago for a much more aggressive intervention by the European Central Bank in this. That does involve a perhaps temporary change to its charter. It needs to have a wider role. The ESM, with a budget of 500 billion capitalization, I remember when that sounded like a lot of money, we would burn through that if the bond market takes against an individual member state. I'm less convinced by the idea of Eurobonds. I think the logical institution to step in is the European Central Bank. The European Stability Mechanism, as I say, can play a part, but I would see that perhaps instead underpinning a bank recapitalization, a bank restructuring effort across the EU, the establishment of a series of national bad banks along the Irish NAMA model, which would allow us to recapitalize and restructure the bits of the economy that can be and allow those that need to die as quietly as possible. So we can take a great number of lessons from this. This can be fixed. I do believe the euro will emerge stronger. But because of a lack of trust, because of a lack of community spirit, we have not seen a comprehensive solution to what assuredly is a comprehensive problem. And the fact that the European Parliament is full of ideas but no power has meant that we are pretty sidelined to the whole process, and I think that needs to be remedied also. So much to do, and I look forward to hearing your further ideas as well. Thanks very much.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, David, for inviting me here. I was asked to talk about austerity, and David suggested fiscal governance as austerity as a title. In a way, this story is much more about austerity. It seems that the governance part is pretty much what is being imposed on others. However, I did add a little sort of caveat about flexible austerity, and you'll see why. So the big questions, of course, is, are the barbarians at the gate, or actually are they already inside the gate? If you ask many people in Greece and other Mediterranean countries, they are. The axe has actually already fallen, and heads have rolled, unfortunately. So maybe, again, to follow my predecessor, just a quick, why austerity? If you remember, fiscal discipline went south in 2008 with the global financial crisis. I won't go into the details as to why. The only country where fiscal discipline had actually it's actually never gone south, it was always south, is Greece. As you can see here, having deficits of 5% and more in the good times, which meant that when things started going badly, they just got even worse. And then you have Ireland, as we'll see later, and Spain that were doing relatively well, but unfortunately, as has already been mentioned, they had real estate bubbles that ended up bursting. So, of course, public debts went up as when deficits increase. And in some cases, there were countries like Greece and Italy who were and Portugal, I guess, to some extent, who were in situations that just left less room for maneuver. However, I think it's important also to remind ourselves that not all debt crises are the same. 3 countries have received bailouts. Another one is currently threatened to receive a bailout in Spain. And then, the big question is what happens with Italy, and that's still a big question mark. But from what we can see here, in fact, and in this graph, basically I plot competitiveness versus banking claims on domestic private sector, so trying to figure out how much, in a way, the banks were exposed to the domestic economy. And you can see, of course, Ireland at the top, where there was a huge, the banks, basically had lent lots of money to the real estate industry, and people borrowed and they bought houses, etc., and there was a bubble. But competitiveness was actually good. I mean, Ireland before the crisis was doing extremely well. Remember the Irish Tiger and all these things, and even before the bubble itself built up. In fact, one might say that the bubble as a result of all this great performance, and the same to a certain extent with Spain. And then you kind of go down, and what you realize is that, well, in countries like Italy and Greece, the problem was not banking so much. The problem really is a problem of competitiveness, which is much lower. And when combined with relatively poor fiscal management, it makes things much more difficult. And that in a way lays the foundations for the kinds of austerity that we're looking for, and how to approach this. And this will be kind of the second part of my presentation. So Greece, in a way, is the classic debt crisis. Too much government borrowing in good times, you have the fixed exchange rate through the euro, overvalued exchange rate, loss of competitiveness, you have the external shock, and then basically everything goes bad, investors panic, and at some point they say, oh, Greece will not be able to maintain its debt because interest rates are increasing, so let's increase interest rates and more, and then it all becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And at some point, money stops, and that's when the EU and the IMF have to come in and bail out the government. In Ireland, well, it's the other extreme. What you have is a classic banking crisis that became a debt crisis, right? Economy grows, credit is cheap, bank leverage themselves up, people buy real estate, and at some point, the music stops, to use the metaphor of my predecessor. And again, government goes in, tries to bail this out, and at some point, the markets say, why should we, in a way, continue financing this whole system that seems to have no end in sight? And currently, this is the same situation with Spain, right? Bankia is bankrupt. It needs to be recapitalized. It had already been recapitalized once. How much is it going to cost the Spanish government? Can the Spanish government afford it? And then basically now it's up to investors to decide whether the Spanish government can actually save the banking system or not. And if the markets, as they seem to be willing to do, that they don't trust what's going to happen, and again you're going to have a self-fulfilling prophecy, well then we'll have the fourth bailout that will happen, and then creates a new level of crisis in Europe. So these two extremes, and we'll see in a way what it involves in terms of austerity. What I want to do now is, and this is an exercise that I tried to do, is say, well, what do we know about fiscal consolidation, right? In a way, what does theory and what does past fiscal consolidations tell us? In a way, what have we learned? What are the lessons? And the goal here is to really for governments to regain or maintain their sovereign bond, the confidence of sovereign bond investors, right? So for Ireland, for Greece, well, when we say regain, it's the ability to go, in a way, and tap financial markets again, so they don't need to be supported by, other governments or the IMF. For countries like Spain or Italy, is to try to maintain that confidence so they don't have to ask for a bailout. No great secrets here. The lessons tell us that reductions in current government spending are better than tax increases or cuts in investment expenditures. Why? Because they're the toughest ones to make politically. And once you've made the effort, you're not just going to give it up, because in a way you've expensed a lot of political capital. Whereas, raising taxes to generate revenue is much easier to do. And at the same time, cutting public spending, of course, sends a very credible signal to investors and saying, you're very committed and serious about fiscal consolidation. And then, tax increases and cuts in public investment are also, in a way, hurting economic growth in the future, right? Because if you're not investing in your infrastructures where, it decays, then ultimately that hurts you. And tax increases, depending on the types of taxes, but if you're trying to, tax corporations more, individuals, et cetera, or, value-added taxes, you're just making the economy in a way more expensive, and that hurts its competitiveness. For sure, in terms of cuts in government spending, what you cut matters, and usually that involves social welfare spending and government wages and employment, including pensions. These are the types of cuts that are seen, again, according to those economic studies that have looked at the successful fiscal consolidations, that this is where, in a way, one has to cut in order for this consolidation to be successful. And when we say successful, is sustainable and therefore manage to convince markets again to lend to governments and finance their budgets. These types of cuts are also seen as good for economic growth because in a way they lead to a reduction in unit labor costs, right? If all of a sudden, and this is, for example, the case in Greece, where a lot of people have jobs in the government that tend to pay very well, you can retire early, you have a good pension, etc., but which means that you have very little incentives to go in the private market or in the private labor force because the salaries are not the same, but at the same time it makes it difficult for private companies to hire people at wages that in a way would be competitive with other economies, depending in which sector you are. Maybe sometimes it's with emerging economies, because people will say, hey, I can go and work in the public sector and I'll come and work for you only if you give me such salaries and benefits, etc. And then private firms say, we can't do that. So what do? You don't grow, you don't invest, and that economy grows much more slowly. In a way, the part that grows is the one that the government finances. But as we saw with Greece, there are great limits as to government-led growth. I guess it's another model of capitalism, if we want to call it that. There's export-led growth and you have government-led growth. Adding structural reforms to the financial consolidation exercise also increases the likelihood of success, according to the literature. And the idea here, of course, is that generating growth, and this is the part that maybe requires more discussion as to how do you generate that growth. We hear a lot about we need a growth compact and we need this and we need to stimulate growth, but in a way, how do you do it? The problem is that it takes time. But if growth can resume and in fact be even increased, that will generate the revenues that would allow, in a way, deficits to decline and ultimately create surpluses that will help repay the debt. Other elements that are seen as useful, currency devaluations. Unfortunately, in the Eurozone, that's not possible. Although some seem to say that Greece just has to leave the euro and reintroduce the drachma and everything will be fine. I don't believe that's going to be really a solution. But there is this idea that all you need is devaluation and competitiveness is reestablished automatically. Well, that may work for a short while, but not for very long. Another element, plans should be made for the medium term, not in the short term. So in a way, there has to be flexibility in the fiscal consolidation effort, because I think it was, again, Gabriel Glöcker earlier today was saying, things change. They're never the way that they seem. Every 3 months you go back and, the economy is doing worse or this or that. So in a way, the plan has to be adjusted and contingencies have to be planned for. Otherwise, you put yourself in a straitjacket that is even more difficult to deal with. So a gradual approach is better than shock therapy. Some say, you have this open window, it's very short, and that's when you have to cut, and that's when you have to make the difficult decisions. But again, according to studies, gradualism works actually better. And there is no evidence to show that there is a correlation between fiscal consolidation and government failure. So it's not because you're a government, you're trying to do fiscal consolidation, that you're going to be thrown out of power or anything. And in fact, if you look in Portugal, in Spain, and even now with the Monti government in Italy, these are all governments that have been put in power in a way to do fiscal consolidation, right? And you can look in other instances. Latvia is a great example of that too. So it doesn't seem that there is necessarily, when people recognize that it has to be done, there is not necessarily a political penalty. So if we kind of look at the various programs very quickly, you have Greece, as we said, is the typical debt crisis. Greece had one program that was supposed to last for 3 years. Now it's been extended to 2015. And probably when we're done, it'll be like 2020 or 2025, if Greece is willing to stay inside the euro and if the EU is willing to support it, which I think it will. So reduce government spending in line with what has been said, wages, employment, and pensions, social programs, increase revenues, so increase taxes, value-added taxes, excise taxes, which are seen as having a less harmful effect on growth in the medium-long term. Lower tax evasion, which is a huge issue in Greece, as we know, very difficult to tackle. The most fascinating thing when looking at Greece is, at the beginning of the austerity program, the finance ministry went on strike. So the people who were actually supposed to get the thing going decided that they could not have their salaries cut and all that. Why would the government want to cut the finance ministry's salaries when they're the guys who are supposed to go after tax evasion? That's beyond me, but anyways. Improve competitiveness, liberalize labor and services markets. Ireland, well, it's all about fixing the bank. So you fix the bank system, but you still have now a debt over 100% of GDP, which you'll have to pay back. And the only way to pay this back is by cutting spending. Although the idea here is that, well, basically, let's go back to pre-real estate bubble. In a way, we could not afford all these great social programs and all this extra spending. So, let's bring the clocks back, and then we'll be fine. Increase tax revenues in the short term, and then as things get better, reduce them again. Portugal, somewhere in the middle. Portugal is like fix everything, right? The banks, reduce government spending, increase revenues. It's kind of a combination of everything, and improve competitiveness at the same time. As we saw, Portugal was kind of in the middle, so it even has more to do than other countries. Austerity in Italy and Spain to avoid the bailouts. Italy, in a way, is not in such a bad place. It has a primary surplus, so it can do a little bit more cuts in social welfare spending because, in a way, its interest spending has gone up. But the main issue in Italy is competitiveness. I can't blame the Germans for not trusting Berlusconi. He didn't do anything for 10 years. Italy, is at the bottom of world rankings when it comes to economic growth, somewhere with Zimbabwe. Basically zero over a 10-year period. And that's, in a way, the task that Monti has, which is not easy because, there is huge, in a way, sclerosis in the economy. In Spain, well, it's a little bit like Ireland. There has to be a fix of the regional and local savings banks, and then spending has to be brought down. The only difficulty here is that it has to be done by the regional governments. So you'll see here, this is the planned fiscal consolidation over 2011-2013, quite ambitious. These are the forecasts by the OECD. We'll see if that will happen. But you see in Italy, now the focus is actually they're trying to raise revenues as opposed to cut spending in the meantime. Now, are they planning to do this through growth? We'll have to see. Spain, Portugal, Greece, it's all about spending. It's not about revenue increases because, very difficult to raise taxes when the economy is not doing well. Overall assessment, generally, countries are in on the program. Assumptions and forecasts are revised, and they generally follow the lessons. So the assessment is a positive one generally. So conclusion, if I'm allowed a few more minutes.
Leading off. Yeah.
Okay. Austerity is not an option. In a lot of the debate, it's like we can do austerity or we cannot do austerity. It seems there's a choice there. But in fact, there is no choice because the big question is who's going to pay for it? Where is the money going to come from, right? If investors are not willing to fund further deficits, well, then someone else has to fund them, right? The question is, who will do that? Fiscal stimulus is not really, and again, is not really an option. The fiscal margin of maneuver for most of these countries is gone. Monetary stimulus might be an option to some extent. There's already been a fair amount done, and Gabriella certainly talked about what the ECB has done, and I think Henrik will do that also later. But generally, the banks are in a bad state. So a lot of the liquidity and support that is going through the banking system, well, is not necessarily going into the real economy, but is trying to fix the financial system. And ultimately, and this might be because the Eurozone has a flaw, not necessarily. I think, again, the issue is about competitiveness, right? The monetary imbalances where the North, in a way, lends to the South, so the South can buy from the North, which is the same as what the Americans have done with the Chinese, cannot go on perpetually unless the Germans and the Dutch are willing to keep lending to the Greeks, to the Italians, and others. And that cannot go on. So at some point, prices have to rise in Germany, and prices have to drop in countries like Italy and Greece. If that's going to happen within the Eurozone, it means more inflation in Germany, and it means, in fact, deflation in countries like Greece and Italy, for instance. But you need flexibility, right? Because things will change, it will take time. And that's the only way, in a way, that the lessons of fiscal consolidation tell us. It takes time, but if you're flexible, but you keep on with the program, it's going to work, right? And in fact, that's what has been happening. You listen to what Alyn is saying to the Spaniards. It's like, okay, here's what we'd like you to do. Oh no, you don't want to do that? Okay, we'll give you a little bit more flexibility. The same with the Greeks. There's always this back and forth that, as long as you're making reasonable effort, we'll support you, right? If it takes more time, it's fine. We understand it's more difficult, right? The economy is not growing as fast as we thought. Oh, tax evasion is more difficult to deal with. But, you're making a reasonable effort. It's credible. We'll support it. Now, and again, what is reasonable varies with time and economic conditions. But certainly, flexibility is an option, and I think so far it's been there. Although maybe not sometimes in the rhetoric, but don't forget, going back to national interest, a lot of the rhetoric is for domestic consumption, not for European consumption. So it takes time. That's what history teaches us. Consolidations are particularly painful when everyone is doing it at the same time. In a way, that's the part where the literature doesn't talk about it. It's one country. You're having difficulties, but then if everyone around you is doing well, it's relatively easy. But if everyone's doing austerity at the same time, is doing fiscal consolidation, it just makes things much more difficult, right? And in a context where the world economy itself is sluggish, well, I think we're in for quite a long time. But hopefully, the EU institutions, the Germans and others will think that there is value in the euro and will continue to support it as long as, those countries like Greece and Spain and Portugal and Ireland get on with the program and do reasonable efforts, it will work out. But, it's messy, it's tough, it's painful, but, the alternative, in a way, that's the issue, right? What's the alternative? And the alternative is probably a lot worse. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Henrik.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I want to thank to David for the invitation. And I've been flying all morning. I got on a plane in Lisbon at 6 in the morning, so I haven't seen the news. So I don't know if everything that I'm going to say now may be already outdated and Spain has already been rescued, but bear with me for a little while. The title of the presentation is Living with EU-Imposed Austerity in Spain. And what I want to do is build a little bit on what Patrick just did now, talk about what has been the consequences of the crisis for Spain, what have been the causes of the crisis, and whether or not discipline and austerity are working in Spain. I don't want to overwhelm you with data, but I just want to focus on two particularly set of data that I think are very strong reflections of what is happening in Spain. This one has to do with unemployment. And what you see is since the crisis started in 2007, there has been a dramatic increase in unemployment from a little bit over 8%. It's expected to reach over 24% this year and go down a little bit next year. It's the highest rate of unemployment in the Western world. The second set of data that I want to focus on has to do with debt. Spain has one of the lower levels of debt, like Patrick indicated before, prior to the crisis. It was a little bit over 36%. It's expected to increase to 79% this year and 84% next year. So that's just to highlight the dramatic impact of the crisis. I want to stress that when you talk about the crisis, and who is to blame, there are essentially two significant narratives. The first one that I highlight up here has to do with the typical interpretation that we have countries like Spain that have a long history of being fiscally responsible, that took advantage of the very low interest rates when we became members of the European Monetary Union. And when that happened, that created bubbles, particularly in the real estate market. Then we didn't do the reform that we had to do. We lost competitiveness. And then the crisis finally hit us, and instead of doing what we need to do, we're still resisting it. We want money from Germany. We want the European Central Bank to loosen the grip of monetary policy. And we want to push for a fiscal union so that we don't do the things that we're supposed to do. So this is one narrative, and I think it's the dominant today. But there is a second narrative, which is maybe not so dominant, which has to do with the countries in Southern Europe that were encouraged to join a monetary union that was institutionally flawed from the very beginning. Everybody know it. And the rich countries were the ones that designed the monetary union to their own advantage. And not only that, but they were the first ones to flout the rules. And I really want to emphasize this because now it's easy to remember that Spain and Greece and Italy may be responsible, but the first three countries that violated the Growth and Stability Pact were Portugal, France, and Germany. And not only they violated the Stability Pact, but in order not to get punished for it, they changed the rules. So that's something to put into context when we treat some countries as irresponsible and not responsible. At the same time, it is true that in some of these countries, they didn't have any problems with having their banks lending tons of money to irresponsible and spendthrift countries like Spain, because they were not making so much money domestically. And when this investment failed, then suddenly the countries like Spain came asking for money. And the question is, well, when Germany and others are rescuing Spain or Portugal or Ireland, are they really rescuing these countries or are they rescuing their own banks? I think that's another way to look at how this money is being spent. And they're imposing this draconian condition, this austerity, that in some cases brings an unprecedented loss of sovereignty. And it's interesting that when you look at this narrative, it could easily apply to Germany after World War I. It could easily apply to Kosovo more recently, but it's an interpretation that can apply to Southern Europe and Ireland as we speak. Like everything in life, probably the truth is a little bit in between both narratives, but I really wanted to stress that there is not such a simple issue. And that leads me to the second part of the presentation, which I want to talk about the causes of the crisis. And there is this impression again that all these countries have been fiscally responsible. And in the case of Spain, and Patrick mentioned it before, Spain had one of the lowest rates of deficit. It has actually a surplus in the 3 years prior to the crisis, and it had one of the lowest rates of debt in the European Union with Ireland. So how do you reconcile this image of being fiscally responsible when in reality it had one of the strongest fiscal positions prior to the crisis? And what you see in this graph is essentially the years in which Spain had a surplus prior to the crisis. So the deficit is not so much the cause of the crisis, it's the consequence of the crisis in Spain. When the real estate market bubble exploded, prices decreased dramatically, and you have they are down by almost 22% by now, and that has a dramatic impact in the economy because the economy was largely dependent on the construction sector. And what happened was that the government responded with a massive stimulus package of 8 billion euros, and that's essentially is what brought the deficit into account. It wasn't so much that there was a deficit before, it was the deficit that was caused to deal with the crisis. Now, whether this response was adequate or not, that's a different question. But the fact is that it was the consequence of the crisis, not the cause of the crisis. And when we talk about the debt in Spain, the crucial difference that we have to make is that we're not talking about public debt, we're talking about private debt. That's what the real problem in Spain lies. And that was caused by this reckless behavior of bankers and borrowers. And you have the data here, 227% of GDP by the end of 2010. That's what the real problem in Spain is. It's not the public debt, it's the private debt. But the second major problem that we have has been the dramatic loss of competitiveness of the Spanish economy over the last decade and a half. And here you have the figures here. When we talk about a problem with that, what we have in Spain significantly is a problem with the balance of payment. Spain had one of the highest balance of payment deficits in the years prior to the crisis, and that's something that Patrick addressed. And that's a reflection of the lack of competitiveness of the Spanish economy and the fact that we did not implement the structural reforms to make the Spanish economy more competitive prior to the crisis. How do we address with that? We have essentially two options. I mean, and Patrick mentioned it before, we can either run a bigger surplus with the rest of the world, and that sounds probably unlikely because where are the markets going to come from? Or there is an internal shift of competitiveness within the European Union, and what you see is that the exchange rate of those in Southern Europe decline and those in Northern Europe increase. And this is what we have to deal now with. How do we deal with this current account deficit? And you have essentially four options. You have monetary easing, you have deflationary adjustment, you have financing by the core in which we borrow from the rich countries, and the last option will be debt restructuring. And what we see now is essentially a combination of the second and the third, a little bit of an internal devaluation with some support from the rich countries and in terms of monetary policy from the European Central Bank. Now, how did the European Union and the Central Bank respond to the crisis? Well, essentially the three words that I have there, austerity, austerity, austerity. Spain has been asked to lower the budget deficit from 8.9% at the end of last year, and this is a figure that keeps on being updated. But as of now, it's 8.9%, and they want Spain to be down to 3% by 2013. It's just the Commission just came out yesterday offering the possibility of an extension if Spain does all the things. But this is a dramatic adjustment, and it's something that has virtually no precedent in a Western country to bring the deficit in 2 years from almost 9% to 3%. And then the other things that have been imposed by Brussels, structural reforms. The government already approved 2 labor reforms, one in 2010, another one a few months ago. There has been already 4 financial reforms. None of them has really addressed the problems in the financial sector. There has been more accountability in terms of making sure that the figures and the data coming from the government are trustworthy. And now the Spanish government has agreed to have external consultants looking at the accounts of all the banks and savings and loans. And the major concern also, of course, is what is happening, like Patrick mentioned before, with the budgets of the regional governments. Now, the third part of the presentation that I want to focus on has to do with discipline. Is discipline working? Is this the solution to what Spain is experiencing? And one of the major challenges, and Patrick mentioned before, is can, through austerity, governments turn around the investors' perceptions and sentiment? And here the major risk, of course, is that Spain is being lumped with Greece. And a lot of people perceive that we have similar problems. And as I tried to explain, the nature of Spanish problems are quite different from Greece. And when we look at the data, between Greece and Spain is quite different. The deficit, again, in Spain for this year is about, it's expected to be 5.3%. In Greece, it's going to be 6.8%. The debt is expected to reach this year 79%. In Greece, it's 190% of gross domestic product. And even though the data is so significantly different, the reality is that the markets are still punishing Spain, and the bond yields continue increasing, and they jumped to 6% in the last few days. And there is increasing pessimism that Spain will need to be rescued. So the question is whether or not an expansionary fiscal contraction will work, which seems like a contradiction on its own. And the problem that we have, of course, for this expansionary fiscal contraction to work is that we don't have growth. The prospects for growth are minimal. The economy is going to be in a recession this year and next year. The country still has significant level of external indebtedness, and the private sector there, like I mentioned before, is quite dramatic. And what we see now is a deleveraging in the private sector and at the same time deleveraging in the public sector. And the combination of both is being very negative for growth. Unemployment is at a record high, like I mentioned before, and more dramatically among young people. People 25 and younger in Spain, unemployment is now 50%. One out of 2 people are unemployed, young people. The structural weaknesses that the country had prior to the crisis, they're still there. The structural reforms are being approved, but it will take time for them to have effect. So when you look at the overregulated product and labor market, the low productivity rates, the low educational achievement, those are problems that Spain still faces, and that is something that is not going to be corrected in the short term. There is a funding gap, although to Spain's benefit, most of the financial needs for the year, for 2012, has already been met, so it's not so dependent from external funding as other countries like Italy or Ireland. Now, the major problem, of course, is whether or not growth will eventually pick up. And the notion is that unless that happens, it's unlikely that the situation will improve. Like I mentioned before, the problem is not so much public fiscal debt, it's on the private sector. So here we had a problem of lending and borrowing that was rather irresponsible for years. But if fiscal profligacy was not the reason for the crisis, then can fiscal discipline be the cure? And I think that's one important question that we need to consider. When we look at the effect of austerity so far, we see that it's only aggravating the problems in the short term. The economy is shrinking even faster than it was anticipated. And again, Spain is expected to be the only country in the European Union next year that will still be in recession. The debt is escalating dramatically from 36%, it's going to be close to 84% next year. And the total debt, including the private sector, has already increased from 337% of GDP to 363 by the middle of last year. And what we see is that more and more austerity and adjustment is likely to increase market tension because it's making the fiscal situation and the crisis worse. And I mentioned there some of the estimates that the country will need between $53 and $64 billion in cuts in order to meet the deficit target. Just imagine the level of pain. So the question is, how can economies grow when you have a parallel process of deleveraging in the private sector and in the public sector? And here, like I mentioned before, the goal to bring down the deficit to 3% in 2 years is dramatic. And how do we balance then austerity and growth? What we see in countries like the US is that they have prioritized the private deleveraging process, and the public one will start now. What we see in Europe and in Spain in particular is a combination of both. And many people will argue that we should focus on the private sector there first because that's where the real problem in Spain is, and then once that problem has been alleviated, then focus on the public sector. But that's not what is happening. And what we see now is essentially a country that is prisoner of a debt trap and that is likely that eventually will have to be rescued. So just to finish the presentation, where does this leave us from a European perspective? And what I think we see happening in the European Union today is a return to the zero-sum politics of the past. We see that a process of European integration was built around the principles of cooperation and solidarity. I think those principles are being eroded today. We see an increase of nationalism in all countries. And we see that this sense of what I call enlightened self-interest, in which the notion was, I help you because I'm helping myself. If your economy grows, then that means eventually you're going to buy more imports or exports from me. That sense that was at the root of the process of European integration, I think it's been now a change for what I call this transactional arrangement. I give you this if you give me that. I think that's something that is negative for the process of European integration overall. There is also a very strong sense of political powerlessness. I mean, I've been in Spain and Portugal very recently, and it's quite dramatic when you talk to people in both countries, because there is a sense that there's just nothing that they can do, that no matter what, they're going to be punished, and that the government don't have the instruments or even the authority to do anything to help them. And there, the risk is, again, we're leaving the citizens behind. The level of political discontent that a lot of these austerity packages are causing in these countries is such that eventually it's going to be a major problem for any government. We still have a crisis of governability within the European Union. I think that's something that we need to address. And the larger question is, again, how do we address this new era of austerity? when we have countries that are like Spain that seem to be trapped in this sovereign debt trap. And essentially, we need confidence, we need money. And those are two things that are, unfortunately, we don't have much of them at this time. So thank you very much.
Here we go. Thank you. Thank you, Amy, and thank you, David, for the invitation. I think it's a nice irony that scholars from all over the world meet on this weekend where England shows this incredible sign of stability 60 years after the Queen's accession to the throne to talk about the stability of this tiny little currency project, which is just a little bit more than a decade old. So the lesson that we can actually take from that, it's easier to keep a queen than to keep a common currency. The topic I would like to talk about today is very boring, actually. It's sovereign default in the euro area. Can the ECB's conundrum be solved? I'll talk about standard measures, non-standard measures, and private sector involvement, and net present value analysis. This is usually the topic I use when my wife can't sleep, and I would like to help her, so I talk about those items. But the reason I would like to raise them in this specific audience is that everything we've just heard went into into a very similar direction, and that direction is, in this crisis, any kind of solution will take time. And as we see today, as we saw yesterday in the past days, we don't have that time. And so the big question is, what can be done in the short term to actually help to solve this crisis? And there are basically three radical ways to end this crisis, which you can see here. Number one is some kind of mutualization of euro area debt. Call them euro bonds, call them joint and several liability in the ESM or others. The second one is basically the same but through a different institutional mechanism, which is monetization of debt through the ECB. And then there is the third one, which we've just addressed, which is massive internal adjustments, be there through the real exchange rate, wage setting, fiscal measures, all of those options we've just discussed. In my view, and I think most of you would agree with that, none of those radical options, which you can see here, are likely to be adopted. A combination of intermediate solutions is much more likely. So there will be a bit of fiscal austerity, there will be a bit of real exchange rate devaluation, there will be some kind of joint guarantee at the euro area level, which we already have, and there will be some ECB focus. And I would like to address this ECB focus today, because in my view, it is very badly understood in the current discussion, and there's a very fundamental conundrum for the ECB in the current situation, which makes crisis resolution so difficult. And this conundrum is as follows, just to put it in a nutshell and upfront. The ECB needs to be able to intervene in sovereign debt markets in order to stabilize difficulties in the current market context. However, it is not allowed to monetize debt. And so it is not allowed to accept a haircut. And since it is not allowed to accept a haircut, it is actually increasing the haircut risk of private creditors. It is this crowding out effect, which is badly understood in policy-making circles, that as soon as the ECB intervenes, and I'll elaborate on that throughout the presentation, as soon as the ECB intervenes but signals that it's not going to accept a haircut, it's actually useless for the ECB or for market participant that the ECB intervenes, because the more the ECB intervenes, the bigger is the risk for a private creditor to be actually hit by a haircut. Why is this so important? Well, the background is this security market program that the ECB started in 2010. Some see this as a breach of the ECB mandate. You've seen the resignations of Axel Weber, Jürgen Stark from the Bundesbank and the ECB board, respectively. When the ECB accepted that, Jean-Claude Trichet in the night from 9th of 10th to 10th of May 2010, it argued that it wanted to contribute to the proper functioning of the euro area and argued that this would facilitate the transmission mechanism of monetary policy. And this was both a bit of a legal way to argue that the ECB could buy debt of euro area countries, but it was also based on the strong commitment of all euro area member states that there would not be a sovereign default. That was very important, and it was negotiated that night. Trichet said the quid pro quo has to be if I buy Greek sovereign debt, Portuguese sovereign debt and Irish government debt, you have to guarantee from the side of the of governments that you're not going to send one of those countries into default. Otherwise, we're going to be in a very difficult situation. And so the ECB wanted to do this because the symmetric purchases of all euro area countries at the same time, the equivalent of quantitative easing as we see it in the United States, might even have been easier from a legal perspective, but much less effective. Because for each Spanish bond, or let's say for each Spanish bond, the ECB would have had to buy 15 or 16 bonds, German government bonds, at the same time, thus not really contributing to the spreads moving closer to each other, but actually perhaps even to a stronger deviation. So the agreement was the ECB should intervene selectively. That's very important. Purchase debt of those individual countries, Greece, Ireland, and Portugal in phase 1, and then later on, this has been addressed in the summer of 2011, they decided to also buy Italy and Spain as non-program countries. The SMP is described by the ECB as this non-standard measure of monetary policy making. Again, that's a little bit a legal way to phrase this. It has to be part of the monetary policy transmission mechanism, otherwise the ECB is not allowed to do it. And they've always made it very clear that this was not a long-term way of intervening in the euro area sovereign bond market, but as Jean-Claude Trichet put it, it was temporary and limited. Later on, that wording was a little bit changed by Mario Draghi, and I thought this was a very interesting statement by Mario in the very beginning to say it's not eternal and not unlimited, which is not exactly the same as temporary and limited, but this is the way central bankers talk. And the way they look at this, or they wanted to look at this in the ECB, was to say, we can do this as long as euro area debt is super safe, and there are not going to be any sovereign defaults. Here you see what happened over time, just to give you a bit of the magnitude of what happened. You see the first phase here, 15th of May 2010, when they aggressively intervened, buying 25 billion euros in the second week, 16 in week 1. Then it went down, it contributed to stability, and then in the summer episode with Italy and Spain, August 2011, you can see that the S&P purchases again went beyond 20 billion, then went down, but overall the ECB is now in the area of 200 billion euros, which it has as government debt of those 5 countries. It doesn't disclose its exact holdings of those 5 countries, is now above 200 billion. Interestingly, they've now stopped. And I want to explain to you why I think they stopped and why we shouldn't expect the ECB to come back easily into the market. And if they come back, we might see some difficulties. And that's a very current problem, because even today, I think the ECB could have intervened. Markets are going crazy. They're not doing this. And I think the reason is the Greek restructuring. What happened in the Greek restructuring? The Greek restructuring was reaching that implicit agreement between Trichet and the heads of state from that famous night of 9th of May 2010. The ECB always said a Greek restructuring could be done. They were always very hesitant, but only on a voluntary basis, so only with voluntary private sector involvement. And initially, when in July of 2011 they first spoke about some kind of net present value loss for investors into Greek debt, they said this has to be purely voluntary, and a very small amount, 21% at that time, in order to allow the ECB to get out, and in order to not hamper or not hurt the ECB's commitment in that Greek debt. You know the story that then followed. AAA countries considered that this 21% haircut was not sufficient for Greece. They shifted to 50% net present value loss in October 2011, and then we finally ended up with something like 75% net present value loss for investors in March 2012. I would like to make a side remark to Gabriel Glöckler, who is no longer here, who said this morning, everything European leaders had to show was continuity. This is clearly a sign of no continuity. In May 2010, they said Greek debt is safe. Then it was 21%, then 50%, and then 75%. But obviously, it's only Greece, right? no risk for other countries. I can understand market participants who don't take those remarks seriously any longer. But the point is that formally PSI is still voluntary. However, the Greek parliament and Greek government, as you might have followed in this discussion, made it crystal clear right from the outset that if investors rejected the voluntary private sector involvement, they would force the default upon the private creditors. And the big question for the ECB, and that's not a technical question, that's a fundamental systemic question, was should the ECB participate in the default or not? And there were different types of considerations which I would like to outline because they're extremely important in fighting the current crisis. The legal issue for the ECB was the following one. Is a voluntary ECB participation in PSI the same as monetizing the debt of a euro area government? And in fact, from a strict legal perspective, it is. The ECB doesn't have a choice. Because if you buy Greek government debt and then you participate in a voluntary restructuring and you actually forgive 50 to 70% of this Greek debt, you are actually providing direct financing to the Greek government. And for Mario Draghi, that was very clear, and he always said, even if we try to build a way, there was an issue to build this through the IMF or through other channels, the spirit of the treaty in that respect is extremely clear. And I share that view, that is absolutely correct. So if we wanted the ECB to participate in a voluntary restructuring, we would have to change the treaty in a very fundamental fashion and say the central bank is allowed to monetize euro area government debt. For all those of you, and you're all experts, knowing the euro area, this is a fundamental change. The amounts we talk about are not small. The ECB owned 50 billion euros face value of Greek government debt. They had bought that at a lower market price. The average, we don't have the exact figures. The ECB is not disclosing them, but of around 75% or 75 cents on the euro. So this gave them a 40 billion euro book value. And in fact, interestingly, a profit opportunity for the ECB had the Greek government paid back that debt at face value, right? You have a face value, or you have the book value of 40 billion, face value is 50, so you could have had that difference. On the other hand, taking a loss through PSI would have implied a massive loss for the ECB, because despite buying those amounts at a lower value, it still would have taken a massive hit on its balance sheet. And for the ECB, the conundrum from a legal and financial perspective is really described in those few numbers here, because even foregoing the profit opportunity would be illegal. It's still a monetization of debt, right? Because you buy debt at a lower price and then you benefit from getting it back in full or from actually getting that difference through the Greek government. Now, what's even more important than those legal and financial implications is the market implications that follow. The ECB always signaled that it was just a normal market participant when buying this government debt. And that was very important, right? Because if the ECB said, I'm senior, I have a senior status, I'm a preferred creditor to the Greek government, for private market participants that would have been very bad news. Because then you, and I'll come to that, and I said it in the beginning, then you actually realize that if Greece has to take a haircut, but the IMF is not concerned and the ECB is not concerned, then the likelihood that your haircut is going to be bigger increases. And so in the beginning, the ECB always said, we're pari passu. We are like all the other creditors, only the IMF, and that is written in all government bonds, the IMF gets a special treatment. However, not participating in PSI has a large negative impact on the private creditor risk, as I just said. Every bond that the ECB purchases and that is then given a senior status increases this potential likelihood of private creditors to have a bigger haircut in the restructuring. And this actually then generates this crowding out effect and runs the risk of destroying the market stabilizing effect of S&P. And which was the solution the ECB adopted in this Greek PSI conundrum? Well, it opted, finally, for not participating in PSI. It got a special bond swap with the Greek government, which to many looked close to illegal. It got new bonds that are now held by the ECB and are not our part, and that didn't take part in PSI. The Greek government is going to pay back those bonds in full, and the ECB has found a way to channel back the profits to the Greek government via the national central banks. The question is now, is this solution viable? And I would say no, period. Because the ECB is no longer now a credible pari passu market participant. And S&P has probably lost, through this very way of solving the Greek crisis, has lost its effectiveness. The current crisis episode is already an indication that the ECB knows about that implication very well. The intervention points where the ECB had intervened in the past, AAA plus 450 to 500 basis points, have been reached in the past weeks. And the ECB didn't intervene. Why? Because what would happen if it started to intervene? If you own Spanish debt, you know that at each bond the ECB is going to buy increases the likelihood that your haircut is going to be bigger. And the implications are even broader. EFSF is technically pari passu. I'm not going to talk in detail about the ESM, which has a senior status, but only for countries that are not on a program and only for loans. But if you look at all of this, as a private market participant, you think the official sector will never want to lose money in restructurings. So if I'm the only private person in there, I'm on the hook and my losses will be bigger. Is there a viable solution? And this is the coming to the end, Amy, of my presentation. Is there a viable solution? That's very difficult. To me, only in the context of joint and several liability in the ESM, where the ECB could then easily purchase ESM, EFSF bonds, do quantitative easing in the American way, and the possible sovereign losses would be taken by the ESM and the EFSF. However, as we all know, this is unlikely to happen without a treaty change, and Germany, my country, is never going to accept joint and several liability in a context that doesn't allow for strong conditionality. The wider implication of this is that we have to decide on a key trade-off. And that key trade-off is that we either find a solution to the current crisis without any treaty change. I don't believe that this is possible. Or we go for one of the two treaty changes which you see here. Either change the ECB mandate and abandon the span of monetization of debt, or change the EMU setup completely, abandon national budgetary autonomy in crisis, thus allowing for joint and several liability in EMU and giving rise to Eurobonds or this broader framework. The conclusions, 5 points. First, the ECB decision on Greece was inevitable, but wrong. The wider implication will be felt for a very long time. I think treaty change and a major shift in the EMU architecture look unavoidable. And the question is, as in the other presentations, time. We don't have time for treaty change. We don't have time for austerity. We don't have time for internal devaluation. So I think the only alternative which is left is for the AAA countries to accept joint and several liability in this framework without a massive treaty change, something the German government is not yet ready to accept. But if you know another alternative, please give my chancellor a call. Thank you very much.
Henrik, just quickly, why did you not mention the LTRO? Because I also had the impression that the long-term refinancing operation came after the securities market program as a replacement.
So first, on Spain, you didn't mention the banks as such. Should the government save the banks that are in problems? And how should this be financed? And also a question on the community method. Has there really been a change? There have been always committees to advise the Commission before the Commission came up with proposals. The Law Committee, the COC, task force. So what's really different nowadays with the Van Rompuy task force? Thank you.
Yeah. For those who don't remember, I'm the representative of Michel Barnier in the room. And I just wanted to make a remark rather than a question, which is that one possible component of the solution to the competitiveness imbalances in the EU and the Eurozone that was not mentioned, and so I therefore have to mention it as an alternative to the internal devaluation, is a full application of the potential of the internal market. Now, the internal market is 4 freedoms. Freedom of movement of goods, services, capital, and persons. And I have been, on the subject of persons, I have been seeing some remarks, seeing some articles recently suggesting that young people in Spain are becoming very enthusiastic about learning German and possibly moving. And on the one hand, it's kind of sad in some ways if you have to move, but it's for centuries a solution in times of economic crisis and imbalance, and it's a possible escape valve. Another possible escape valve is not to move, but to, for example, stay at home and set up an internet company and make direct sales of services across borders. Just without hogging the floor too much, we are really looking at this in the internal market part of the Commission, because this is one way in which you can try to stimulate growth without spending money in a Keynesian way, money that we haven't got. Okay, regulatory reform, liberalization is one, but using the full potential of the internal market, ideally it can make a contribution to growth. It's not a magic wand, but it doesn't cost too much money, so we have to exploit that to the maximum. Thanks.
Can I just back that up by saying I read with great interest the report commissioned by the Belgian Employees Association through Accenture called Turning the Tide. And this was presented in Brussels in November. It's a very interesting survey based on interviews with 500 chief executives of European companies, which underlines the point made just now that education and training, I mean, part of the 2020 formula, but this is a fundamental thing. And my view would be that completing or continuing fully to complete the single market, plus a new application of the structural funds and the successors to the framework programme, are existing levers that need to be pulled down more fully, in my opinion. And I think that it seems to me some countries, some governments at regional, national level and companies have forgotten that actually the single market exists. And I just think that the single market is often disliked by companies, of course, because it forces them to change. But I do think these instruments already in place for 30 or more years need to be sharpened and implemented as a complement to some of these other measures.
So yeah, there was a question about Spain and the problem with the banks. And let me make a few comments regarding that situation. First, I mean, when we talk about the problems of the financial system in Spain, we really need to separate what are the larger banks, particularly Banco Santander and Banco Bilbao Vizcaya, which are well capitalized and they're weathering the storm relatively well, from the problems that are closely associated with the savings and loans, with the cajas de ahorro. And those are the ones that gave massive amounts of loans during the boom years to the construction sectors, and they are saddled now with massive levels of bad debt. Now, the problem has been that the government has systematically underestimated the depth of the problem. So they have always minimized it, and they have not come up with ways to address it. So it's always been a very reactive response, and it tended to be too little, too late. In the last case, when Bankia, which is the largest, it was the result of the merging of 7 of the cajas de ahorros, went bust a couple of weeks ago, it just illustrated the depth of the problem. The conservative government 3 weeks ago came out saying that the banks needed only $15 billion, 15 billion euros of capitalization. And then when Bankia went bankrupt, it turns out that just Bankia, just one bank, needed almost 24 billion euros. So that kind of illustrates how much they've been minimizing the problem and underestimating the debt. Now, the government doesn't have that kind of money, so what did they do? They come up with a crazy idea, which, I mean, it sounded rather original, but I don't think it's going to fly, that instead of giving them cash, they will give them debt, and that then they will go to the European Central Bank, and the European Central Bank will swap the debt for cash. Now, the European Central Bank has already said that they won't do that, that it will be a violation of the treaty. So now the government has to make a decision where is this money going to come from. And the only way that they can come up with the money is they go to the market. But if they go to the market, then they have the problem that the yields are too high, and that the more they do that, it's more likely that they will need a rescue. What the Spanish government is trying to do is just to convince the European partner that they can use the rescue funds to finance bank debt, not through governments. But as of now, the European government seems to be very reluctant to move in that direction. Now there are two external companies that are going to be evaluating the quality of the debt of Spanish banks, and there are all kind of estimates that it could be up to $50 billion. And the big question, and right now there is no clear answer, is where is that money going to come from?
Waltraud Schelkle asked on LTRO, and I couldn't agree more that the ECB already used LTRO because they knew that S&P would lose its power. The bigger implication of this is that we see how few instruments remain available to the policymakers in the current situation. And now we know this. 2 months ago, I was participating in a conference where everyone said, now the crisis is over. LTRO is doing the right job. Everything is fine, and the short-sightedness in that respect is just extremely alarming. So if you look today at the options that are on the table, S&P, as I tried to explain, is no longer a real option, which implies that interest rate spreads for Spain and Italy can rise above 6-7% without anyone being able to intervene. We can intervene through the EFSF, but the EFSF has only 200 billion euros left. With which we would like to save Spanish, potentially other banks, intervene in the primary and secondary markets, give a new program to Portugal. I think that's a bit tight. The ESM is not yet ready, and it's unlikely now that it will be voted before the summer. Germany is likely to vote in September. And then the first 106 billion euros will start flowing then. LTRO is not having the desired effect. It helped the banks in the very short run, but we still see the credit crunch in Spain, in the so-called peripheral countries. And so the effect is really not the one which people wanted to see. The only positive effect economically it has, in my view, is that it has weakened the euro considerably, which is a good thing for the euro area, but that's a bit of an irony. I cannot resist making one remark on the single market, because I completely share your view that there are too many spatially fixed factors in the euro area which do not allow the real exchange rate to work effectively, and I've written about this already several years ago. But I don't share the way you approach this, because you say, well, it's easy now, the Spaniards can go all to Germany. I'm not sure I would buy this from the Commission. Let me be quite blunt. You don't have the possibility to take your pension rights with you from one country to the other. And instead of saying from the Commission perspective, please do that, well, find a solution to that problem, because that's your job and not the job of the Spaniards that now move to Germany. And there are many other areas where I think the single market could be enhanced much more, rather than now saying, let's make a benefit of it. My other more provocative question in this country would be, is the single market compatible with different currencies? And isn't devaluation or currency mismatch one of the reasons for a single market not to function?
On one of the points made?
Yes, so there was a question on what is the difference with the Van Rompuy Task Force, given that we've always seen committees that would advise the Commission. And I think that the biggest difference is that the Van Rompuy Task Force was not a committee to advise the Commission. This was a task force that was set up by the European Council to, in effect, monitor the Commission. And in fact, in a later European Council meeting, it was clear that the Commission was subordinate to the Van Rompuy Task Force and not the other way around.
Thank you. I've little to add to the technical questions, but I'm glad the aspect of population shift has been picked up on already, because and as a passionate pro-European in the mainstream, the SNP, we sit with the Greens in the Parliament. We're at the mainstream of pro-European thinking in those terms, which is pretty rare in these islands currently. Please don't ever say that in public again. The risk that we have, beware politics. And in a room full of technocrats, best of my knowledge, I'm the only democratically elected person here. Beware politics. We are seeing a growth in appallingly bad xenophobia across various member states of the European Union. I touched on this myself here, the delusion that you've got a thrifty north, a spendthrift south, etc. We're seeing all sorts of bad politics. We're seeing the Eurosceptic right and left, and for these purposes they're essentially the same, leaping at this as evidence that this isn't working. We're seeing all sorts of easy answers being peddled in Greece, in Ireland. We're seeing all sorts of irresponsible politics being brought forward. And the idea that a country should export its population is presented as a solution. Now, I appreciate that that's not what you said, and I assure you that is how it would be presented, is just going to fuel the flames. We are already looking at UKIP down south winning the English election at the European elections. That is my prediction. The polls are going in that direction. They come nowhere in Scotland, incidentally, but that is what we are seeing in a major member state. We are seeing a massive growth in some pretty unsavoury parties of all political points of the compass. And in democracies, that's what wins. And you can have whatever external willpower via the Eurozone, but my point about the lack of democratic credibility within each of those ancient historic democracies will bring the entire thing tumbling down. And that is the risk that we're presently running. And we must be very, very mindful of our language on this.
Just to comment again on the issue of competitiveness and the internal market, it's one element, but I think it's a relatively marginal one at this point. Because in a way, most of the problems when it comes to the internal market, I think as Henrik mentioned, deal with actually national governments, putting obstacles into the functioning of the internal market, especially on the services side. So to say that yes, labor mobility is a good thing, or people set up websites and direct sales, not mentioning the difficulties in doing that. It's very easy to set up a website, but then people actually have to find it credible and buy from it. And why would Germans buy from a Spaniard, a Spanish company on the net? That's an aside. But for the bigger transactions, that will create employment. I think pensions is certainly one in terms of labor mobility, but there are in various sectors, and yes, that is what the Commission has been trying to do for a number of years. But I think it's through, in a way, the opportunity is possibly through these programs, through that where in a way pressure can be made, can be put on the governments to say, okay, now, as part of your structural reforms, you also have to remove these, in a way, protectionist measures, which are kind of camouflaged in various ways that prevent the proper functioning of the internal market. So maybe, in a way, it's kind of the other way around, I would say. But it's still, ultimately, sadly enough, it's the national governments that have to make it happen. The only thing that the EU, the EU institutions, the IMF, and all that is keep the pressure on. But in a way, with regards to the politics, as I said, it's a delicate balance. You have to keep just enough pressure for things to actually keep moving, and in a way to say, okay, well, they're moving along, and then we can continue support it. But if you push too hard, then the whole thing comes falling. And it's a trial and error situation. Unfortunately, there's no magic recipe to say, here's the target, here's the number. So you try and oops, there's a little bit of backlash, you give in, you go back, and it's messy and it's ugly and it scares the markets because it's not certainty which markets want. But this is the nature of democratic politics, and I don't think we can avoid it, unfortunately. Otherwise, yeah, the Chinese, they just say, here it is, and then they do it, but they have other sorts of problems, so I'm not sure that we want to go that way.
It's been mentioned before in the last few months, even in these halls, that in some ways the international community could help. I was just wondering, by some professors here, that somehow China could do something which I don't really believe could be possible, or the IMF should take a more active role, even though that she condescendingly criticizes everyone in Europe. I was just wondering what the panel's view on international, transnational institutions were for not just recovery, but for fixing some of the specific problems you mentioned.
Thanks. I had a follow-up question in particular to Sebastian on Bankia, but before that, very briefly on the internal market issue. I mean, we don't claim it's a magic wand. We don't claim it's a magic solution. It's one component among many for dealing with the situation. And we are very aware of existing barriers, in particular pension portability. I mean, we have already a single market act. We're preparing another one, trying to remove the various barriers to single market, and we will continue to do so as long as necessary. So yes, there are indeed barriers, perhaps not so much for younger people. On the presentation of internal market issues, yeah, of course we have to nuance our language and present it differently to different audiences in different member states. But I do think it's a little bit sad if we are getting the advice, well, it's best not to talk about Europe because it aggravates people. Yeah, we have. Well, we have a single market which opens up huge opportunities, and we're very proud to talk about them, obviously in language which is adapted to the audience in question. But my specific question on a totally different subject to Sebastian in particular was, given the situation of Bankia and other banks also in different places, do you think it's ever going to be feasible, first of all, without a European resolution framework in place, and secondly, with a European resolution framework in place, to actually allow a bank to fail? Now, as I see it, this can be done if two main conditions are met. First of all, there has to be effective funding of the deposit protection scheme, and secondly, there has to be an effective firewall around to prevent systemic consequences. And perhaps a third one, there has to be rationality to prevent an irrational panic effect on the markets, but that's perhaps the most difficult one. And we saw with Northern Rock in the UK, an institution which could perhaps without too much difficulty have been allowed to fail, that it was not allowed to fail. So is it actually feasible in this particular case, or ever in the future, to actually allow an institution to fail in a structured, orderly way without systemic consequences?
I don't have the answer to the question. I mean, I think the whole problem of moral hazard is at the crux of the crisis. But I do feel there are a couple issues that we need to consider. One, Spain is going the same route as Ireland in terms of the nationalization and the savings of the banks. And I think Ireland is hard to argue that Ireland has been a success. I think that it could be argued that it's been a failure. So the whole business of nationalizing banks and to rescue them, I'm not sure that it's proved that it works. Two, the cost of nationalizing Bankia, again, is going to be close to $24 billion. That is the equivalent of all the savings that the government has made in cuts over the last 3 months in education, in healthcare, and in all welfare programs. Now, the political cost of that is enormous, and for the government it's extremely difficult to explain why they're giving $24 billion to Bankia when they're eliminating employment and making cuts in the welfare state. So I go back to the point that were mentioned throughout the presentation. I mean, we ignore our citizens at our own risk. I'm not sure that continue bailing out the banks is going to get us out of this mess.
The question was on the international and transnational possibilities to help Europe in that crisis. I must admit I have a lot of understanding and sympathy for both the Americans and the Chinese people to be hesitant when it comes to assisting the euro area in its rescue efforts. We talk about as it's often said, one of the largest and richest areas in the world, and then not having the amounts necessary through joint and several liability, for example, to guarantee the debt inside the euro area, and calling therefore the Americans and the Chinese is a bit of a strange construction, and we can explain it on a political basis, which is there's simply no majority in the AAA countries right now in their populations to back the debt of other countries. Why should we then turn to the US in an election year, or China, which is now probably coming close to a complete change in its economic history, to ask them to provide support? I would rather turn to larger countries with AAA in the euro area than to China and the US.
Okay.
And the US has no money.
Exactly.
Or will.
Okay, let me close it this way and encourage everybody to pick up any further questions that you had not asked or not been addressed properly. There's lots of other communication that I think we could see happening. And to welcome everybody back in about 15 minutes for the next panel. Thank you.